Exploring the Gothic. And I'm going to talk. So the description is Gothic fiction is more than women with great hair fleeing from dimly lit mansions. I really love women with great hair fleeing from dimly lit mansions. So we can get back to that in a little bit.
Yeah, me too.
This panel will discuss and explore the themes and tropes of Gothic horror. What makes those tropes and themes effective? What are the different subgenres of Gothic fiction? And what are some modern Gothic works that the panelists recommend? Alrighty. Why don't we get started with introductions? And I'm going to start with you, Maria, because if we go this way, your picture's there.
Sounds good. Hi, I'm Maria Schrader. I'm an associate editor at Apparition Literary Magazine. I also write fiction and poetry. I have a couple of stories out in anthologies from Air and Nothingness Press, and I'm hoping to start querying a Gothic novel soon. So diving into that world. And I have cats.
Your cats.
Cat tax.
So cute. So much cute. Okay, Caitlin?
I'm Caitlin Starling. I am the author of several books, including most relevant to this panel, The Death of Jane Lawrence, which came out in October and is, at least at the beginning, a very traditional Gothic horror, Gothic romance before it starts going completely off the rails. And I've dabbled in Gothic in other kind of adjacent genres. You could even say my first novel, The Luminous Dead, is Gothic, except it's cave Gothic, sci-fi cave Gothic.
Okay. And so I'm Catherine Lendoff. Among other things, I am the publisher at Queen of Swords Press. We are a small press based in Minneapolis. I've written a number of published ghost stories, and as of yesterday, discovered that I have an essay accepted for Divergent Terror, which is an anthology of queer horror. And I wrote an essay that is essentially Edward Gorey made me a queer goth. So it seemed very appropriate for this weekend and this particular panel. I also teach the class on writing Gothic horror for Kat Rambo's Rambo Academy, and that'll come up in October. So a couple of quick housekeeping things before we get going into discussion. If you have questions for the panelists, please put them in the chat. My laptop monitor is not big enough for me to monitor Discord at the same time, so if people have time afterwards, we'll check in on the Discord. And if not, we'll wave politely and maybe you can talk to us later. So if you're one of the attendees and you have a question, just put it in the chat and we'll get to that in the last part of this discussion. So speaking personally, as a goth and a fan, one of the things that I really love about Gothic fiction as a whole and its various permutations, and you've got Gothic romance and you've got Gothic horror and you've got, things that are just sort of goth adjacent, whether they're gothy, but are they really goth, But one of the things that I truly love about it is just the flexibility of the subgenre, the things you can do with it, both as a writer and as a reader and a fan. And Caitlin, you just mentioned you'd written cave Gothic, which sounds like a great idea. So we can talk a little bit about, the extent to which when we talk about the Gothic, we're talking about location and atmosphere. So I'd like to kick off a little bit about that. So why don't you tell us a little more about the cave Gothic novel to kick us off, Caitlin?
Yeah, so The Luminous Dead, when I wrote it, I did not write it intending it to be a Gothic novel, although Gothic structure is so soaked into my brain that it just came out that way in hindsight. But The Luminous Dead is ostensibly about just a woman who has taken a high-risk cave exploration job in the medium to far future on a different planet, where she has to go in alone in a suit that basically takes care of her needs for the next month with only the voice on her radio to keep her sane and tell her where to go. What it's really about, of course, is trauma and buried secrets and trust, and if you can trust your own perception of the world around you, and all sorts of fun psychological weirdness. But it's that, it doesn't have the house on the hill, house on the moors, storms every night, no nightgowns, no candelabra, but it does have this constant back and forth push and pull about, you know, what's real, what's not, what can be trusted, what can't be trusted, how tightly are you bound by your failures of someone else's failures of the past, your own failures in your past, that sort of thing, which I think is just very quintessentially Gothic.
That sounds like fun. I'm making a mental note for later, things to go back to. So how about you,
Definitely.
Maria?
For me, I mean, I think you can Gothic anything. I'm from Minnesota originally, so you could do Minnesota Gothic. You could do,
Totally do Minnesota Gothic.
I should do that sometime. I love all of the, you know, sort of driving out into the countryside and just like the kind of eerie sense you get around the cornfields. But I mean, I've definitely heard Midwestern Gothic, Southern Gothic, Cave Gothic, I don't know, Mars Gothic. I think you could do like sci-fi Gothic, and that could be really fun. Luminous Dead sounds very sci-fi Gothic as well.
Yeah.
I'll have to pick that up. I'm like 100 pages into the Death of Jane Lawrence and really enjoying it. So, um, I think I haven't gotten quite to the part I think where it really kind of breaks bad.
It's about halfway through that suddenly, like, in my opinion, it still stays in the very traditional Gothic horror milieu, but it gets very also weird and from some perspectives genre bendy. It's been interesting to see who that works for and who it doesn't work for, who thinks this is like this is like so Gothic, it's just dripping with it, and people who are like, well, this isn't Gothic at all anymore, this is so weird. Which points to sort of the subjectivity of the genre too, I think.
That's true. Yeah, I love what you were saying about perception. I feel like perception and what you can trust and what you can't and is such a huge part of the genre, especially with the sort of, you know, more horror elements. I think a lot of times it deals with isolation. It really deals with the atmosphere of a particular place. Like one of the things I love about reading Gothic and writing Gothic is to really just sort of sink into a landscape or a setting, this sort of, you know, microcosm within the macrocosm, and what influences it, what makes it frightening, what makes it powerful, how do you explore it, how do you survive in it, you know, how do you use it. So I don't know, that's sort of my feelings on it. I think this is my favorite genre, and I'm only just really getting started into reading a lot of the modern work in it. I started with Wuthering Heights when I was like 9, which is probably too early for that, but my parents didn't stop me, so here I am.
I definitely started with Jane Eyre too young,
Mm.
and it was formative. And then Jane Eyre the musical.
Ooh, I
There's a
didn't know there was a musical.
There is a
I'm a
musical.
musical person.
It is on Spotify, and it's actually pretty good.
Huh.
Ooh, I'm
Okay.
writing that down. Excellent.
Wow. Yeah, I came into it pretty much through Edward Gorey. So when I was around 11 or so, my mother took me to the stage production of Dracula with the Edward Gorey sets, where
Ooh.
he had done like felted bats with little glowing eyes all the way down the curtains. And Frank Langella was playing Dracula for that run. And this was, you know, he is still a gorgeous man, but in his salad days, you know, at one point he rips his shirt open so that, you know, Minna can feed on him, and the whole audience went, "Woo!" So it was kind of a pivotal moment of my, ooh, Gothics are fun stage of things. So I actually came into it, apart from Edward Gorey, through Gothic romance. So Victoria Holt, Mary Stuart, a lot of the authors who were writing, you know, sort of 70s Gothic romance, where you actually, you know, you do have the woman in the torn nightgown running on the cliffside, or the Moors on the cliffside. You know, they're all in great shape. Their hair looks amazing. It's, you know, good times.
I really want a special edition of Jane where that's the cover. I'm just like, someone call me. Let's do this.
Way to go.
Come on. There's a scene where she's running away barefoot in a nightgown, in a torn nightgown from the house, although it is in the middle of the day. But we forgive her.
It's expression, you know, we can make it night, then just put the sun there, but the lighting is all very.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, so we touched a little bit on location, and we had just kind of started to spill over into the characters that form a lot of the Gothic reading experience. So why don't we delve into that a little more? what for you is the kind of character that you identify with a Gothic story?
The thing that I always circle back to is it's somebody who usually for economic reasons doesn't have a choice of where they are. Whether that's Gyre the Luminous Dead taking a contract that is incredibly abusive and dangerous, or Jane getting herself into a marriage with a guy she barely knows, or Jane Eyre from becoming the governess at was it Thornfield? It's been a long time. And so on and so on. That usually, not always, Mexican Gothic is a great exception that proves the rule, but is usually someone, often a young woman, but not always, especially if you are stepping outside of Gothic romance into like the Gothic horror originals, where you sometimes have Jonathan Harker for a while or whatever else, who is in a situation that they don't have the resources to get themselves out of easily, and who is often in a social situation where they are the odd man out or odd woman out, odd person out. So that even if there are people around, like even if there's a sprawling family tree, multiple generations in this creaky old house, they're not a part of the family, and they don't have access to the rule book, and they also don't have anyone they can go to say, this is really messed up, can you get me out of this? And so they're sort of subsumed into the world that they've found themselves in.
I love what you're saying about social power, especially because I feel like that comes along with economic power a lot, where it's and one of the things that I think about Gothic, and this is certainly not true for everything, but as sort of a broad spectrum, I think of it a lot as like, the woman protagonist, because I think Gothic fiction deals a lot with soft power a lot of the time, or if, there is violence, then it's very thought out, it can often be a last resort, or it can be very sort of like shocking because that's more of a transgression. Um, but I definitely, someone who might be a little bit of an outsider, whether through personality, like Catherine in Wuthering Heights, she lives in this house and she's, the daughter of the guy who owns it, but she's kind of, more of a wild child. And then there's Heathcliff, who's, brought in separately. Or Mexican Gothic deals with so many different layers of the social politics and economic politics and the history and all of this stuff, to position Noemi, who shouldn't be an outsider, as an outsider.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, because I think that, again, there's always an exception, but I think it can be difficult to put Gothic with a protagonist who is really familiar with the, where it's like, this is my territory, because I think so much of it is about exploring exploring this new place and feeling out of place and trying to figure out how to navigate it.
Yeah, Wendy Wagner did a great job of balancing that with her novella, The Secret Skin, that just came out from Neon Hemlock last year, which is Sawmill Pacific Northwest Gothic. It's very, very good. And it is, the protagonist is the daughter of the family in question, but she left years ago because her family didn't approve of her being a lesbian and among other things, and she left. And now she has had to come back. And so she's trying to figure out what has changed in the intervening time, and also dealing with her feelings about not really wanting to be back, even though I think her parents by that point are dead. It's just her brother who she's always gotten along with. But she has to relearn the rules in a sense, or at least start resurrecting them. She has to remember what it's like to live with those rules, which I thought was a great way into that thing. And you mentioned how protagonists, even if they're not the young ingenue woman, tend to have this, the soft power situation, or I would say tend to be put in positions or victimized in ways that we associate with femininity. And it made me think
exactly.
of Will Graham in the first season of NBC's Hannibal.
Yes.
He's, this is a guy who dresses in great outdoors clothes, and looks like he shops at Cabela's and goes and just fly fishing, and fixes boat engines. And he is nevertheless, by the structure of the story, sort of queered and or feminized by what Hannibal Lecter is doing to him and the people
Mhm.
around him, and it's really interesting to watch that and watch it play out with an otherwise masculine coded character. And it's a lot of fun to play with in fan works too. But
Jonathan Harker, kind of similar.
yeah,
Very similar vibes with that.
Yeah, I was also thinking of things like the protagonist in The Woman in Black, who
yeah,
is a young man who, goes to this house and ends up being trapped there, while he's trying to do his job. Which, makes me think in terms of, you brought up the economic constraints, and I definitely think that that's a big factor in a lot of the older and traditional Gothic, certainly. I think that there's also psychological constraints. So you have things like Under the Pendulum Sun, where, you know, you know, is she really trapped in fairy, or is it that she feels obligated to find her half brother? It's kind of that sort of murky space where she could leave, but she's opting not to because there's something pulling her in. um, one of my personal all-time favorite Gothic narratives is Crimson Peaks. And just, I mean, she's a rich woman, but she's a rich woman at a time when her husband would have controlled her wealth. um, but there are still other options. She could leave with the doctor, she could do some other things, but she's choosing to stay because she wants to know what's going on, and she is emotionally pulled into this deeply dysfunctional relationship. And I think that that's something you see a lot of in more contemporary Gothics. Thinking of Mexican Gothic in particular, she feels obligated to rescue her cousin, so she stays put because of that.
and speaking of Jeanette Ng, who's the author of Under the Pendulum Sun, when I was still writing Jane Lawrence, I was running into problems with some structural issues, and they were kind enough to sit down with me over breakfast and kind of talk it out. And of course, we had solved the problem by the end of the conversation, as often happens. And but what it came down to was I was afraid to let my protagonist really want things of her own, as opposed to just wanting to stay to solve the problem. And so we had this great conversation about how desire is sort of intrinsic to the Gothic. The main character isn't just a damsel in distress, isn't just being tossed on the waves of fate. There is something in the story that calls to them, and that calls especially to their darker nature, or to things that they're not sure they want to face about themselves, and sort of seduces that part out of them. It doesn't happen in everything. I think in Mexican Gothic it doesn't really come up that much, but it is something that I really enjoyed exploring, and it really it makes it gooey. I think when the protagonist, the worst thing possible isn't that the house will keep the protagonist against their will. It's that the protagonist might choose to stay at some point, and not just stay to be the hero, but to stay because this is in some ways their better option.
That's a nice way of putting it. Maria, did you have anything you wanted to add to that?
I just really loved all of that, and I one of the things I also like about the Gothic is sort of the boundaries of maybe monstrousness or transformation. I think I don't want to call Gothic soft horror because it's really its own thing, but I love reading and bringing in these sort of more horrifying elements and these sort of more monstrous elements and more transformational elements. One book that I literally just finished reading and I absolutely recommend is Sorrowland by Rivers Solomon, which is sort of a Southern Gothic and just really incredible. Reading it was like a punch in the gut, and I just like there's so many elements of that. Also, if you liked Mexican Gothic with its mushroom motif, there's some of that. And I'm also thinking about like Rebecca, which I love the miniseries. It's not very well known, but the miniseries with Charles Dance as an adaptation for Rebecca, because I think it's I really like the portrayal of him as sort of like this, sort of unknowable, monstrous man. And in that miniseries in particular, you can really see um, the way that like trauma has shaped him. And it reads to me as much more of someone who's suffering from, PTSD rather than, someone who's this sort of, I guess, abusive figure in his own right. Because I've there's been discussion around that I've seen, but
Yeah, Rebecca is one of the ones that I feel is kind of a problematic narrative. Um, it, essentially because yeah, I do view it as an abuse narrative, and reading the book in particular because the main, the point of view character is so self-effacing. She never even has a name. That it creeps me out in a different way, and I'm not always I often wonder if du Maurier intended that, that extra layer of creep factor. So it isn't just, are you in the house on the moors? Is the, Mrs. Danvers really, out to get you? Is it haunted? But in addition to that, there's all this other stuff that's just like, so. But yeah, it's a complicated piece. It is definitely a complicated piece.
yeah, which I love about the Gothic genre. I feel like it can be really complicated, and I don't know. I it's naughty. There's layers. I like it, and I like to think about it.
Okay, so we got our first question. Recommendations for modern books that feel like they're Victorian or pre-Victorian. We've touched on Under the Pendulum Sun, which is by Jeanette Ng, and it's about a couple of missionaries, Victorian missionaries, who go to Faerie and what happens to them there. It's really, really interesting spin on that particular, form of the subgenre. What other recommendations would you make that maybe we haven't talked about yet, or something that you want to return to and really, say, this is the thing you should be reading or watching?
I was going to say Under the Pendulum Sun too, honestly, because
Me
it does
too.
it in particular does some really interesting and deep work with religion and faith.
Yes.
That I feel like a lot of modern authors shy away from, and just is really, really great. Jeanette has a really great understanding of the history there in missionary work, and it keeps it complex instead of in the hands of another author that could have gotten very flattened down. When instead it's actually the meat of the book in a lot of ways. So I really like that. I like to think that The Death of Jane Lawrence falls into that category, even though it's set in a one step to the left version of a mashup of Victorian and post World War II England. It makes more sense when you read it, but I tried to really go for both stylistically and on a prose level and on a structural level, something that felt at the very least directly linked to Victorian Gothics. Beyond that, I'm not sure. Most of the stuff that I've been reading is more recent and is using the structure, but taking it in interesting, usually hybridized ways where it's pulling in other subgenres.
Yeah, I have to back what everyone else has been saying. I know that it's out there, but I've also been focusing on more of the hybrids.
Okay. Yeah, I have a collection of dark fantasy and horror out called Unfinished Business, which includes several of my Victorian ghost stories, which is, can be its own thing, but I do it in very Gothic terms. I had a piece in an anthology a couple of years ago from Fox Spirit Books in the UK called Respectable Horror. And that's one that's worth, hunting down if you get a chance to, because that features a lot of stuff with either Victorian style or elements of that. It's worth noting that unless we're talking about, the Brontes, where Anne Radcliffe and so forth, that a lot of the stuff we read was actually written after the Victorian era. It's just set there. You've got, among other things, at the turn of the century, at the end of the 1900s, you've got this huge flowering where there's a ton of women and queer authors who come out of the spiritualist movement, who are writing these really complicated, really meaty ghost stories that are dealing with, among other things, the horrors of domestic life, and whether that's being trapped or that's having no options, which is not always necessarily the same thing. And whether your longtime companion has passed on and you're, envisioning her appearing in the, in the lamps or whatever. So there's a lot of that kind of stuff. And it's technically, you're getting toward the end of Victoria's life. So it's out of what we think of as the Victorian period, but a lot of it is set back there. And so it's worth looking at things like Edith Wharton's ghost stories. If you like ghost stories, there's a ton of stuff out there, and a lot of it is very atmospheric, and it definitely feeds a lot of that craving that's looking for, that Gothic feel.
I feel like there's a thread too, or a habit in Gothic writing. Very little of it is set in the setting that the author lives in. Like even the original pre-Victorian Gothics are in Italy, a very interesting mythologized version of Italy. But so, yeah, so I think it's actually like it's a rarity to find Gothic that is set contemporaneous and in the same place as the author. So that little time period we have in the Victorian period where you have Anne Radcliffe and the Brontes and else, that's weird. And it's usually, I don't know if it's just because it's so much, you want to be able to play with the atmosphere and you want to play with the rules, that it encourages sort of setting bendiness. But it's definitely something that I've noticed come up again and again when I've, read books and researched the history of the genre and that sort of thing.
Yeah, it's also, there's also, of course, Polidori's The Vampire and Dracula and, Oscar Wilde. Picture of Dorian Gray is a very Gothic novel, and it's a very queer Gothic novel, and worth exploring and reading through that lens. Did you want to add anything, Maria?
No, because all of my examples I'm thinking of are still very modern. Like I was like, oh, there's the Haunting of Bly Manor miniseries. Maybe you could call Talented Mr. Ripley kind of a Gothic, but those are not Victorians, so I'm striking out a little bit over here, unfortunately.
Totally okay. Yeah, I mean, there's certainly, there's a lot, I think, of more media outside of books that plays with a lot of those elements. So why don't we talk about that? Do you have any particular favorites? I've already mentioned Crimson Peak, and we'll cheerfully go back to it. Anybody else have anything that they want to recommend or return to from something we discussed earlier in terms of, television, movies, all of that good stuff?
I mean, Crimson Peak directly made me write The Death of Jane Lawrence, so I'm right there with you. Like I literally walked out of the theater and went, huh, and 2 days later I was writing what became the first couple chapters.
It is such a writer's movie. It's just brilliant. I love it.
And I'm still sad that it was marketed as like a jump scare horror movie, because I think that did it a disservice in its reception, because it was always intended to be exactly what it is.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think Crimson Peak, really reawakened my interest in the genre, where it was like, oh yeah, like here it is again, the stuff that I remember from my childhood, reading Jane Eyre and reading Wuthering Heights. So that was really exciting. I really like The Haunting of Hill House on Netflix, or The Haunting of Bly Manor, which I would say is the more Gothic of the two. Hill House is my favorite. Some of my friends disagree, where you have like the quintessential, haunted houses and, what the ghosts represent and how the characters interact with them, and some of the characters become ghosts, and it's just, just layers and layers and layers of, in Hill House, family trauma, which is like my favorite thing. And then Bly Manor, there's more romance involved, and it's more complicated in that way.
I think one of the things that I've found pretty interesting in the last few years is watching the spillover between Gothics and steampunk. Great taste, especially on things like, the Nevers, which is a series on HBO that's set in Victorian England. There's a group of young women who discover that they have acquired mysterious powers, and it's what happens after that. And it has a lot of both Gothic and steampunky elements to it, which I find pretty interesting to watch. For me, I think that the Shirley Jackson that stands out in terms of what I think of as Gothic is We Have Always Lived in the Castle.
Yeah.
which, if I read it as a teenager, I probably would have regarded it as a how-to manual. So I'm glad I didn't come to it until later in life. But there's a lot of elements of that particular story that, the old decaying house, decay as a metaphor for the state of the society around the sisters, how the sisters deal with that, the atmosphere, the intrusive young man who may or may not be a relative and what happens after that. I mean, there's just a lot of stuff in there that plays with very quintessentially Gothic elements, but it's supposed to be set in, 1940s, 1950s. But that's definitely worth checking out, especially if you also like The Haunting of Hill House.
Yeah, there was
And the miniseries Haunting of Hill House I know is really different from the book Haunting of Hill House. Like it's completely remade with with the jumping off point from the original. I really, really like the miniseries, those even with that not being a very faithful adaptation.
Invention of the Nevers made me remember, which I'm surprised I forgot because it was another big influence, was Penny Dreadful, which sometimes didn't quite stick the landing on certain plot lines, but overall it nailed, especially with Ava Green's character storyline, as fraught as that storyline itself was, the actual atmosphere of that, that being trapped by the past and being haunted both physically and spiritually, psychologically. And that sort of like, there's almost like a thin veil between her and the rest of the world that she can't reach across for reasons that are both personal and external to her. Super, super influential to me in terms of how to like the tools you can use to depict that sort of honestly, psychic agony.
I was on a Gothics panel last month at another convention, and we were discussing Penny Dreadful, as a matter of fact. And somebody asked, "Well, how can you tell if something is Gothic?" And one of the panelists said, "Well, is Eva Green in it? If the answer to that is yes, just go with it."
She's got a very Gothic face, especially when she does
Sometimes.
it's the great eyes.
Yeah, let intensity. So yeah, I enjoyed the first two seasons of Penny Dreadful, and I skipped the third one on the recommendations of like everybody I knew. So
I think I got like 3 or 4 episodes into the third season, and then I was like, I don't know. Like I've been willing to put up with a lot of wildness, but I think I've hit my limit.
there was a lot. There was an awful lot going on there. Yeah.
There was, yeah.
Okay. Oh, somebody's got a really good question here. What would you say has been your biggest challenge when writing within the Gothic?
Mine has definitely been trying to judge what is a wild enough twist versus a too wild twist. It's a very interesting sweet spot to try and thread the needle through, because I feel like Gothic traditionally has a moment where things get weird. They do something completely unexpected, or at least expected within a certain range of, okay, so someone is someone's long lost twin sister or whatever else you have, the reveal of the mystery. But depending on the audience, so Jane has a reveal towards the end that to some people shifts the genre entirely to the point where it's no longer enjoyable, and to other people it makes them go, wow, this is really refreshingly Gothic. It actually goes far enough in this. And trying to predict what that point is and how to make it feel correct to people who love the genre. Because I mean, if I'm writing in the genre, that's my audience. I'm not writing Gothic for people who don't like Gothic. That would be ridiculous. So yeah, it's finding that balance of, what's interesting enough without being too off the wall.
I think for me, it's kind of about balancing the more horrifying elements because I can't tell when it's kind of gone maybe a little bit too far and a little bit too gross. I saw the movie Annihilation a couple years back, and the visuals of that was very influential to me for the novel I'm hoping to query soon. Um, but how gross can you get before it's a little bit too much body horror, which that can be kind of a very flexible line. There's a moment in Sorrowland where a mother who has this sort of supernatural strength hugs her child after a dangerous thing has happened and is so strong that she literally cracks his ribs, and he's like, 5 years old or something. And I was just like, wow, like that is such like, I don't even know how to describe that. It was just like such a moment where I just sort of like set the book down for a second. It was like, wow, like that's such an image. And so you can have that kind of like horrible, stuff that you wouldn't necessarily, I don't know, think of in a Gothic. But where's the line before it's a little bit, it becomes too much horror? Like, how much can I describe this? How visceral can I get? How much, you know, blood or sort of, mushroom fruiting can there be?
Yeah, I think, putting on my writer hat for the moment, the temptation to lay on the atmosphere so thick that you lose the story is always kind of a fine line. How much is too much? And where does it spill over to the point where it's like Gothic, you're soaking in it, and you're still getting a full story as well as all of the trappings and atmosphere. So somebody's got another good question here, and they're asking about getting back into Gothic literature. They experienced some gatekeeping. They're looking for more representation of people of color, non-Western Gothics. We talked a little bit about Victorian horror, but I think it's probably worthwhile to branch out and talk a little bit about some of the various kinds of Gothic horror that is written by authors of color. And we've mentioned a number of authors of color during the course of this conversation. River Solomon, Jeanette Ng. We haven't talked about Helen Oyemi yet, but White is for Witching, and there's a number of other stories as a retelling of Hansel and Gretel, Gingerbread, where Oyemi is playing with a lot of those same elements. Sylvia Moreno Garcia, obviously Mexican Gothic, a lot of her other work as well. Certainly is both. Mexican Gothic is actually Gothic set in Mexico, which is pretty cool, and it's in a different time period. It's post World War II, but it has a lot of the trappings that we associate with Gothic fiction, Gothic horror. Is there, who else would you recommend? Can you think of anybody else who's working, either other authors of color we haven't talked about, or authors working in non-Western settings?
So I haven't got a chance to read either of these two yet, but they're on my short list. One is The Hacienda by Isabella Cañas. It's pitched as Mexican Gothic meets Rebecca, but it looks really, really great and very in the traditional vein. But I would, from following the author and from the promotional materials, it looks like it does a lot of the same direct confrontation of colonial legacy that Mexican Gothic does. And the other is a YA book, which is a retelling of Jane Eyre, called Within These Wicked Walls by Lauren Blackwood, which is Jane Eyre, but in Ethiopia, which I have also heard amazing things about, but haven't had a chance to read yet. And as an aside or a related thing, I don't have any specific tools or recommendations for how to deal with people who are being racist or gatekeeping or weird. But I am heartened a little bit that we are seeing a broadening of the genre at the moment in terms of what is getting published. Whether the books that are getting published now are in the direction you want to take Gothic or not, I'm hoping that means that there is more willingness from editors to take chances, to promote, to widen the field, to make sure that there's room. Fingers crossed it stays that way, as always. But yeah, it's a tricky area. And hopefully, what I really like about the more recent broadening is that it does tackle things like colonialism head on. It does look at those things as sources of horror in and of themselves, which they are, and sees them as, not set dressing for Gothic, but an intrinsic factor in it. And as much as I love Under the Pendulum Sun, it's Jeanette Still chose to write about white missionaries going to fairyland. That was, and to do certain things in the story that I think they do very, very well. But hopefully, that's not the only option anymore.
I heard wonderful things about Within These Wicked Walls as well, but I also haven't had a chance to read it yet. I would maybe say Cassandra Cobb, but maybe that's too much more in the horror section. Nothing But Black and Teeth, that might be too much horror. Um, but definitely seconding all of the names that have been listed so far.
Okay, so is there a setting that you think wouldn't lend itself to a Gothic story, out of curiosity? Because we've talked a lot about, how you can pretty much take Gothics anywhere. Is there something where that wouldn't work, for either of you as a writer?
Trying to think of a situation where I couldn't shoehorn it into being Gothic, and I'm not coming up with much. I think it comes back to, for me, I would have trouble / not know how to write a Gothic story with a character who has a lot of power, like without having to strip it away first. So you can do that, but you'd have to somehow isolate them, take their power away, take their money away, and then you're sort of artificially back to the standard. But in terms of setting, I think you can make pretty much any setting work. I mean, I did it in a cave with 2 characters and like no house, just a cave. So I feel like you can push it.
I feel like personally, I would have a lot of trouble writing an urban Gothic, like, setting it in a city. There's so much going on, and you can have, I mean, a lot of the things that we were talking about as like parts of, Gothic literature can very easily be applied to cities as far as like the atmosphere or, social stratification and power and all these different things. But for me, a lot of it is the character. I'm sorry, I totally lost my train of thought. I would probably have to do that as sort of like almost a locked room kind of thing, where it's like, in a single building or something that could, instead of sort of expanding my net really wide. Um, I think also a character who has a lot of power. And one of the things that I wanted to bring up that I haven't seen, and maybe I can get some recommendations, is I haven't seen a lot of Gothic fiction with older protagonists. And I wonder if that's because of the power dynamic, because they've just had more time to sort of amass the social capital and power. Um, but if anyone knows any, I'd love to know and sort of like add that to my list.
Now I'm thinking about
Glad
apartment
you
building
brought that up.
Gothic.
Anyway, sorry, go ahead.
Oh, just an aside of apartment building Gothic of like, so if you've seen the not Gothic, Only Murderers in the Building,
Yeah,
but Gothic. So like a building where
yeah.
everyone knows each other, and then someone new moves in. I could see it happening. So yeah, what were you gonna
It's
say?
basically small town, right? Small town dynamics
Yeah.
that's, if it's like, oh, I'm gonna take the L to downtown, because I'm in Chicago, it's like that would be harder for me.
Yeah.
So I'm glad you brought up older characters, because that is one of my things. In non-Gothic world, I write a series of novels about menopausal werewolves, and it's set in a mythical town in the American West. It's not particularly Gothic. It does have horror elements. But one of the things about that is that in the course of writing it, I started building this bibliography of science fiction, fantasy, and horror with older female protagonists. And one of the things that came out of that was how people read protagonists. And to me, a protagonist is your central figure for the story. For a lot of other people, if an older character has, a walk-on and 10 lines, miraculously they're a protagonist. And where that gets interesting is I'm wondering how many people, sit through Rebecca, and for them, Mrs. Danvers is the main character. So it's that kind of feel. But I was thinking, Helen Mirren did a movie about the Winchester House.
Oh
It was
yeah,
not
it's
particularly
I think
well
it's just called
received, but
Winchester.
it came out a couple of years ago. And it definitely had a lot of Gothic elements, but it was definitely kind of a spillover into jump scare. So you get there are a few things out there, but one of the things that I found in the course of building the bibliography is that publishing in particular, but that spills over into other media as well, kind of goes in waves. So what happens is you get a wave of the things that are like the hot things to be writing and publishing at a given time, sparkly vampires, haunted houses, whatever. And you get a whole bunch of younger authors and younger creators working on that. And people have to stick around in the field long enough to start writing older characters because they're generally perceived as not very marketable.
Mm-hmm.
And so what happens a lot, within science fiction and fantasy as a whole is that as writers get older, they are more inclined to take the chance of writing older characters. And a lot of the authors that we've been talking about are younger. I don't think we've talked about anybody who's under 40 who isn't dead. Okay. So I think it'll make a big difference seeing, what happens next. What happens when those authors are, in their 40s, in their 50s. Will they start writing more things with older characters in them who are protagonists as opposed to being, the witch, the housekeeper, the ghost, the, whatever the various threatening characters who are often older in Gothic style horror end up getting written in roles they end up getting written into. So I guess we'll find out.
Yeah,
Catherine makes note to write another Gothic horror with older characters. Anyway, sorry, go ahead.
My thoughts are just kind of circling around this idea of, if you have an older protagonist, or especially like say someone in their 60s in Gothic, who's the main character, it gets into this very, I mean, on a personal level for me, it gets into this very uncomfortable area of, elder abuse essentially, because it's probably younger characters who are now taking advantage of this, or trying to take advantage of this person who they think can't crack what they're trying to do to them or whatever else. And it's just like, that could be really, really, really scary. But also I'm like, my brain's going, oh, but it's not Gothic because the people with the power don't have the history. But at the same time, I think you can still do it. My brain just would it needs to just be ratcheted around 60 degrees to look at it a little bit differently, in terms of again, coming into an area where you don't know the rules because, technology has changed since you were younger.
Mm-hmm.
And the people who control the house that you're living in and who ostensibly have, your best interests in mind, what they think of as your best interests is not what you think of as your best interests. And yeah, but that is not something that I could write, but it's very interesting.
I just wanted to jump in, and because I thought the elder abuse stuff was fascinating. And there's a thriller, I think maybe this year or last year, called I Care a Lot, and I wish it kind of goes off the rails, but the premise of it is the guardianship system here in the US, where if you can get someone declared basically unfit to run their own life, you can have the court assign you a guardian. And the movie was about, a guardian who's taking advantage of her charges in that way, and scouting out people to try to get signed over into this. And I wish it had focused more on that sort of really horrifying aspect of it. And I think that could become, in the chat, the premise of the movie is terrifying. It's so terrifying and it's so real. I think we saw a lot of it with, Britney Spears's case, if anyone was following that when that came out. So I think that could probably be, unfortunately, very real inspiration for some sort of Gothic thing. It's something a lot of people have to deal with. But
yeah, assisted living is often just an absolute seedbed for interesting Gothic ideas.
Yeah.
And I think that it feeds into a lot of the things that we talked about, atmosphere and power and so forth. And now apparently I'm going to have to write this. Okay, we are down to our last minute and a half, actually our last minute. So last minute recommendations, things that people should definitely be checking out. It can be your own work. That's fine.
I think I've hit everything. I actually made a notes list this time, and I think I've hit everything on it except for Dowry of Blood by S.T. Gibson, which is being reissued by Orbit later this year, which is from the perspective of one of Dracula's wives, and is a great it's not epistolary. It is written as a long letter to Dracula, summarizing the events of the last several hundred years, basically. And it's at times it's just sort of like Gothic in terms of atmosphere, but there are areas where it is structurally Gothic as well, because it's about what it's like to be one of Dracula's wives, because it's not all flouncing around in sheer fabrics menacing Jonathan Harker. And it's also
Chewing on
very,
Jonathan
very
Harker.
queer. It's queer. Everyone's in a poly relationship with each other, which sometimes it works out well and sometimes it really doesn't. But it's just a really great novella. Highly recommend.
Okay. Maria?
Yeah, I think I brought up my whole list. I literally have like a stack of books over here to remind myself of the titles because I'm bad at switching back and forth. But definitely Mexican Gothic, definitely Sorrowland, and Under the Pendulum Sun are three books I've read recently and really, really, really loved. So I recommend those.
Oh, also, since you said it's okay to promote ourselves, I wrote a novella, Yellow Jessamine, which now that I'm thinking about it, it's not Gothic romance, it's definitely Gothic horror. But the protagonist does have power, but the problem is what her past actions have done. So she's trapped by the past still, and her power becomes less and less useful over the course of the novella. But if that's your jam, or you like really rainy, dying cities in a vague fantasy history, and if you like poison, there's a whole lot of poison in that book.
Writing that down.
It's good poison for dollar ratio.
Good stuff.
Excellent.
All right. Thank you very much. This has been a lot of fun. Thanks everybody who attended. I'm sorry we didn't get to all the questions. Feel free to post them in Discord and I'll try and stop by. I don't know, maybe the panelists can stop by as well for a little bit. And have a great rest of the con.